people won't know the importance of the role of Speaker. So what is it and what appealed to you?
The Speaker should be an umpire. The Speaker is not supposed to play for one side or the other, but to know everybody, treat one individual fairly by comparison with another, have a regard to the rights of minority parties as well as to those of the governing party. The Speaker should be always on the side of Parliament if there is a clash with the executive branch. I think the Speaker should always err on the side of wanting to give the House its say and potentially its way. And the Speaker's got to be good on his or her feet, dexterous enough to cope with the unexpected. I mean, I think, for example, if you haven't got a very good memory and you don't remember people's names, that's a bit of a disqualification for serving as Speaker.
The Speaker before you.
Well, Michael didn't find that part of the job that easy. I think he was rather a decent and kind man, and I think he was subject to a great deal of snobbery, prejudice, sectarian, anti-Scottish, anti-Catholic feeling, and so on. I do, but I note the point you make. I like to think that when I looked at the skill set, competent on the feet, fair-minded, interested in maximising debate, willing to speak truth to power, in other words, in dealings with the government, I could tick those boxes. I thought I'd got those qualities. Why did I want to be Speaker? If I'm scrupulously and unsparingly honest with you, at first, for a very short period, I thought I enjoy backbench life. I don't want to be a minister. I'm not going to be asked to be a minister. I wouldn't be a very good minister, but I think I can do something more than serve as a backbencher. And I did quite fancy the idea of serving as Speaker with the accompanying status. But that didn't last very long because it's not my natural instinct to be someone and not have a mission. And so very quickly after deciding, I'd rather like to be Speaker, I thought, well, what would I do if I got the job? And that's when, in that period, and I had 4 to 5 years to think about it, I started to think, well, this would be my plan. I would like to empower backbenchers. Mm-hmm. I would like to ensure there's greater topicality and urgency in debate. I'd like to make reforms across the parliamentary estate to make the place more child-friendly and inclusive. And I would like the idea as Speaker, as I did, I know, in Philip's constituency and elsewhere, of getting out and about, visiting schools, visiting universities, visiting voluntary organisations, visiting faith groups, visiting public bodies, talking to, being questioned by, hearing from, engaging with members of civil society. So for quite a long time, that was my intended platform, and that was the platform on which I stood. And it was the platform which I then sought to deliver. And I think some people who didn't approve of that approach have never forgiven me for sticking to my mission. I remember Peter Hain once saying to me, John, I, as leader of the House, served with a number of speakers. I've witnessed a number of speakers. He said, I've never known in my time in the House a speaker who was not captured to some degree by the establishment. You were never captured. You always behaved as a rather anti-establishment figure.
I agree.
And, whether I was good or not is not for me to say. That is for other people to judge. But did I just want to be there? No, I wanted to be able at the end of my time to say that I did things, that I made a difference, that I brought about change. And a lot of that change I had a lot of support from people on both sides of the House and indeed from staff. But there was a sprinkling of people who were furiously resistant to a lot of what I wanted to do. And I felt to contend with that and to try nevertheless to navigate a way through to deliver the sorts of changes I wanted to make, including, for example, on granting urgent questions. I got regular advice from clerks against urgent questions. There was usually an attitude of, well, why not think about it again tomorrow, Mr. Speaker? Well, the member could seek an adjournment debate next week. And I would say, well, no, the matter ought to be interrogated today.
I don't hold it against you, John, but I think I had many urgent questions.
Now, when you stood for Speaker, I remember, I don't know if you recall, but we had a conversation. It lasted about 45 minutes in Portcullis House, when actually, rather rudely probably, I gave you all the reasons why I wasn't going to vote for you to be Speaker.
And I've never held it against you, Philip, as you know. And I rather respected it.
The three reasons I gave at the time, I distinctly remember. One is that I said I thought you were far too opinionated and were too intolerant of other people's opinions to be Speaker. The second was I thought you'd be too politically correct. And the third reason was I thought you were too young and that you would, in effect, your career would sort of peak and end too soon. What did you make of those criticisms at the time, and what do you make of them now, looking back?
Well, I could understand why you thought as you did, because after all, we'd been on the same side of the House. We'd always got on quite well personally, in some cases very well, but we had now and again clashed in or in the margins of debates. And you probably thought, well, just as I hold my views very strongly, John holds his very strongly, and he just won't be able to resist almost an inadvertent bias and intolerance of other views. I remember saying to you, yes, but the clue's in the title. Speaker of the House, the impartial upholder of the rights of backbenchers. I intend to be the umpire, not an evaluator. But of course, it's one thing to say what you would do, and it's another to prove to someone who's sceptical. And you didn't believe me. And I suppose the only thing I would say in response, Philip, is that a couple of years later, as I think you'll also recall, you came up to me during or at the end of a reception in Speaker's House and said, could you have a word? And I said, absolutely. And you said, you'll recall that conversation we had when I told you that I thought you weren't the right person to be Speaker because you would be too opinionated and you'd be intolerant of other views and you'd close people like me down. Well, I was wrong. You've proved yourself to be fair-minded. So looking back, I feel that I was vindicated, but I could quite understand why you thought that. On the point about being too young, well, it seemed to me that I could look after my own interests in that regard. So in other words, when a member sort of said, oh, but that would mean you finishing very young, I thought, well, so what? That's my choice. Now, I regarded you as very fair-minded. I can think of another colleague, an older colleague, who said to me he would very much advise me against standing for Speaker. And he didn't make those other arguments you made, but he said, what are you? 45, 46? And I said, yes, I'm 46. And he said, so what, you'd do the job for 8 or 9 years? And I said, yes, about that. He said, so you'd finish at 55? And I said, yes. He said, well, how are you going to make a living after that? And I said to him, well, Richard, I said, I think I'll manage to keep body and soul together. And he said, well, I think very unwise, very unwise. And a few days later, he turned up as the campaign manager for another candidate. So, you know, I knew what his game was. He was just trying to discourage me from standing. I don't think the point about age really was compelling, because if you looked historically, as I think I said on June the 22nd, 2009, when I stood for election, Speaker Grenville was elected at 29 and Speaker Addington at 32. Indeed.
So relatively old then.
Yeah, indeed, both of them went on to become Prime Minister in a different era. And yeah. I said, no, look, I don't think that's a problem. I felt that, as you say, by historical standards, I was quite old to be Speaker. So looking back, I feel you were wrong, but I don't think it was surprising that you held the views you did. And although I hoped you'd support me, did I really think you would after some of our slightly waspish exchanges on political matters? No.
I think you once called me a troglodyte, I think, in a debate.
I think I did call you a troglodyte, yeah. But look, you know, the thing is, you took the time and trouble, Philip, to take me aside. I think we sat and had a cup of coffee together, and you were willing to talk it through, and it was done, as always in your case, it was one of your great qualities, not one of mine, without a shred of unkindness, still less malice. I mean, I'll give you an example. No doubt we'll come on to all my failures of where I think you're particularly good and I'm less so. You've always been very good at playing the ball rather than the man or woman. And yes, don't forget, I've spent long periods of time, very enjoyable periods of time in the chair listening to speeches by you, particularly on private members' bill days on Fridays, but not only on those days. And, you know, you would rip an argument apart of an opponent, including people on your own side of the House, but it was never done with personal hostility or venom or malice. It was always done with good humour and sometimes in quite a matter-of-fact way. And you would sometimes tease a colleague. I remember one colleague who is, I think, now a member of the government, and he said, well, I can see, Mr. Speaker, how my honourable friend will make a very good minister in the future. She is singing from the government's hymn sheet to perfection. And I applaud that. And she's entitled to her view, but I just happen to think she's wrong. And it was done very gently. And I think she knew, probably, if she was bright, and I think she was quite bright, that you were taking her apart. My weakness has sometimes been to be too personal and to end up offending people. And I made mistakes in that regard, mistakes that you haven't made.